My name is Petra. I am 29 years old. And the dress my mother mocked in front of 11 of her closest friends was a dress I had bought specifically for that evening, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I had worn it once before at a podium in the same ballroom, 2 years earlier, and I wanted to feel like that version of myself again when I walked back through those doors. My mother didn't know any of that. She had never asked. That is, I have come to understand the central fact of our relationship, not cruelty exactly, not malice in the way people picture malice, but a sustained and total lack of curiosity about who I actually am. She has a version of me in her head, assembled sometime around my 16th birthday and never updated, and she operates from that version with complete confidence. The daughter who couldn't quite get it together. The one who needed managing. The one you love because she's yours but don't particularly lead with in conversation. I want to tell you about the gala. But first I need to tell you how I became nobody special. Because the gala was not the beginning. It was just the night the gap between her version of me and the actual me became visible to a room full of people who had no reason to look away. The gala was held on a Friday evening in late April at the Harrington Grand, a hotel ballroom in the city center that hosts 6 or 7 charity events a year. The kind of venue with high ceilings and round tables draped in ivory linen and a raised stage at one end with soft uplighting in whichever color the event committee has chosen for the year. This year it was gold and deep blue. I know because I had looked it up beforehand. Old habit. My mother called me on a Tuesday, the 8th of April, at 6:22 p.m., to tell me her friend Carolyn had backed out of attending with her and she had a spare ticket and it seemed a shame to waste it. She said this in the tone of someone offering a favor, which is how my mother frames most of what she offers, as generosity flowing in one direction. I said I would come. She seemed mildly surprised, then pleased, then immediately practical. She told me the dress code was cocktail attire and that she hoped I had something appropriate because the women at these events took it seriously. I told her I had something in mind. She said, "Good. Don't overthink it." I arrived at her house at 6:45 p.m. on the evening of the gala, April 25th. She was ready, which she always is. My mother is precise about appearances and has been her entire life. She was wearing a champagne-colored dress she had bought in March specifically for the event. She looked at me when I came through the door. She looked at my dress, deep green silk, mid-length, simple cut, the dress I had worn to the award ceremony 2 years earlier, and her expression did something brief and controlled. She said, "That's what you chose." It was not a question. It was a filing away. I said, "Yes." I picked up my bag from the chair. "Shall we go?" Before I tell you what happened once we were inside the ballroom, I want to ask you something. Tell me what time it is where you are right now, and whether you're somewhere familiar or somewhere new. I keep thinking about the specific quality of light in that hotel lobby, the way the chandeliers turned everything amber and slightly soft focus, and how strange it is to walk into a room where 2 completely different versions of your life exist at the same time, layered on top of each other, and only you can see both of them. My mother's name is Diane Voss. She is 57 years old. She has lived in the same city her entire life, has worked for 23 years as an administrator at a regional insurance company, and has a social world that is carefully maintained and deeply important to her, a network of women she has known through work and neighborhood and church committees, women with whom she has lunches and exchanges birthday cards and attends these kinds of events. She is not a cruel person in the way the word is usually meant. She is warm to most people. She is generous with her time in her social world. She simply has, where I am concerned, a set of operating assumptions that were formed a long time ago and which she has never seen a reason to examine. I was not a difficult child. I want to be clear about that because the story she tells, and she does tell a story, in the gentle, sighing way of mothers who mean well, implies that I was hard to reach, hard to help, always going my own way, never quite fitting in with what the family had hoped for. What I was, in fact, was quiet. I read a lot. I had 2 close friends rather than a large social group. I was interested in things my mother found impractical: language, writing, the specific mechanics of how communication works and why it fails. I applied to a program in communications and rhetoric at a university 4 hours away, and my mother, when I told her, said, "What does someone do with that?" She was not being dismissive on purpose. She genuinely didn't know. And rather than asking, she filed it under the same category she had been filing things about me for years. Unclear, unlikely to lead anywhere concrete, probably fine but not worth highlighting at dinner parties. I graduated in May 2017 with a 3.88 GPA and a part-time job I had held since my second year writing communications materials for a nonprofit that worked in public health advocacy. The work was specific and technical, translating clinical research into language that could be understood by community health workers, grant committees, local legislators. It required knowing exactly which word did what and why, and I was good at it in a way I hadn't been good at many things before. I remember sitting with my first solo-authored policy brief in October 2016, 11 pages, commissioned by a county health department in northern Ohio, and understanding for the first time that the thing I had always done quietly, privately for myself, was actually useful in the world, that it had weight. By September 2018, I was working full-time at a mid-sized communications consultancy that specialized in nonprofit and public sector clients. My starting salary was $48,400. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in the city, 14 minutes from my mother by car, which was close enough to see her regularly and far enough to maintain the distance I had learned, by then, that I needed. I did not tell my mother much about my professional life. This was not a dramatic withholding. I didn't scheme or plan it. It was simply that when I shared things with her, they came back diminished. Not cruelly. Just processed through her framework and returned to me in a smaller form. If I mentioned a project I was proud of, she would nod and ask if it paid well. If I mentioned a professional development I was attending, she would say something about how I had always done things in my own way, which sounded like a compliment and wasn't quite. So over time, I stopped sharing the specifics. I answered general questions generally. I visited on Sundays, I called on Tuesday evenings, and I kept the architecture of my actual life in a separate room she had never been invited into. The gala invitation was, in retrospect, a door she had opened without knowing it was there. The Harrington Grand's annual fundraising gala for the Regional Arts and Community Foundation, RACF, is a mid-size event by the standards of the city's charity circuit. Roughly 200 attendees, a catered dinner, a live auction, a brief program with remarks from organizational leadership and occasionally from invited speakers. Ticket price for general admission, $375 per person. My mother's company purchased a table annually as part of a corporate sponsorship arrangement. The spare ticket from Carolyn's cancellation was worth, therefore, $375, and my mother had offered it to me as a kindness. What my mother did not know, because she had never asked and I had never volunteered it, was that in March of 2022, 2 years and 1 month before this particular April evening, I had been invited by RAC's executive director, a man named Douglas Harlan, to deliver the keynote remarks at this same gala. I had been working at that point for 18 months on a pro bono communications strategy project for RACF through my consultancy, a project that had resulted in a 34% increase in individual donor retention over the prior year and a grant proposal that secured $1.27 million in foundation funding in December 2021. Douglas had asked me, in January 2022, if I would speak at the spring gala about the role of communications infrastructure in nonprofit sustainability. I said yes. I worked on the remarks for 6 weeks. I wore the green dress because I had bought it for the occasion, and it made me feel, in the mirror that morning, like someone who knew what she was doing. I spoke for 19 minutes. The room was attentive. There was a standing ovation from a portion of the room at the end, which I remember being surprised by, not because I thought the remarks were poor, but because I had not expected the formality of it. Douglas thanked me afterward with both hands on my shoulders and said it was the best keynote the event had ever had. I drove home at 11:30 p.m., took off the green dress, hung it up carefully, and went to sleep. I did not tell my mother about the keynote. She hadn't been invited. It hadn't come up. And by then, the habit of not narrating my professional life to her was so thoroughly established that it simply didn't occur to me to bring it up after the fact. The green dress had been hanging in my closet for 2 years when she called to offer me the ticket. When I decided to wear it on April 25th, I was not making a statement. I was not planning anything. I simply wanted to wear the dress that had been in that room before, the one I associated with standing at a podium and knowing what I was doing. It made sense to me in a private way that I didn't feel the need to explain. My mother's look in the doorway when she saw what I had chosen, "That's what you chose," had told me everything about how the evening was likely to begin. I had simply decided, some years earlier, to stop letting beginnings determine endings. We arrived at the Harrington Grand at 7:18 p.m. The lobby was already full. Women in cocktail dresses, men in dark suits, the particular ambient sound of a large room warming up for an evening. My mother was greeted immediately by two women I recognized from prior mentions, her colleague Patrice, mid-50s, and a woman named Sandra, whose last name I had never retained. There were two other women nearby who I was introduced to in quick succession, names I caught as Carol and Lynn. And then my mother's friend group consolidated around us, which in this context meant 7 women total, and my mother put her hand briefly on my arm and said, to the assembled group, with a warmth that was entirely genuine, "This is my daughter Petra." My usual friend cancelled, so Petra's filling in tonight. She's nobody special, don't mind her. She laughed when she said it. A small, self-deprecating laugh that was meant to be charming and disarming, meant to signal, "We're easy, we're casual. My daughter is here as a fill-in. No need to adjust the social register on her behalf." 3 of the women laughed with her, the easy, reflexive laugh of people following a social cue. One of them, Carol, covered her mouth quickly, as though she'd caught herself. I was holding a glass of sparkling water the waiter had just handed me. I thanked him. I turned slightly toward the tall windows at the far side of the room that looked out over the city. The lights of the buildings across the street were just becoming visible as the last of the evening light went flat. Something inside me tightened, briefly, and then steadied. Not anger exactly. Something more like recognition. The specific feeling of watching a pattern repeat that you had thought, naively, might not repeat this time. I did not say anything. I turned back to the group with a neutral expression and listened to the conversation move on to other things. The evening proceeded in the way these evenings proceed. Cocktail hour in the lobby, then transition into the ballroom for dinner at 8 p.m. I was seated at my mother's table, her company's table, 8 seats, 6 of them women I knew only superficially. The conversation across the first course covered the usual territory: work, summer plans, a renovation someone's husband was managing badly, the auction items available in the silent auction room off the main hall. I participated in the ordinary way, asked questions, listened to answers, ate the poached salmon starter that arrived at 8:24 p.m. and was adequately prepared. My mother, across the course of the dinner, introduced me to 2 additional people who stopped by the table, a man named Richard who worked in corporate sponsorship for RACF and a woman named Beth who appeared to be on the event committee. Each time, my mother's introduction was a version of the same. My daughter, filling in for a friend tonight. No name at the first one. My first name only at the second. Nothing further. At 9:11 p.m., the program began. A woman from the board gave welcome remarks. The executive director, Douglas Harlan, took the stage for the organizational update portion of the program. Douglas is 53, silver-haired, the kind of man who is at ease at a microphone and conveys genuine enthusiasm for his work in a way that doesn't feel performed. I had worked closely with him for the better part of 2 years. I had been in his office and on calls with his team, and at one particularly long working session in November 2021 where we had ordered sandwiches at 1:30 p.m. and worked through until nearly 7 p.m. He knew me well. He knew my work well. He spoke for 12 minutes about the organization's accomplishments over the prior year. He mentioned the donor retention numbers. He didn't name the specific percentage, but he described the improvement in terms that I recognized as language we had developed together in the strategy document. He mentioned the December grant. He did not name me. Why would he? I was not on the program that night. I was an attendee at a dinner table, and 2 years had passed since the keynote. I had not expected him to. At 9:26 p.m., Douglas concluded his remarks and stepped back from the podium. He scanned the room in the comfortable way of a man who is used to being in rooms and recognizing most of the people in them. And then he stopped. He had found my table. I watched his expression shift from the neutral, pleasant face of a man wrapping up a speech to something more specific, recognition, and then a kind of pleased surprise. He stepped back to the microphone. He said, "Before we move to the auction segment, I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone in the room tonight who many of you will remember from our 2022 gala, someone whose work, frankly, is a significant reason we're able to report the numbers I just described. Petra Voss, are you here?" I became aware, in the specific way you become aware of something that is happening directly to you in a public setting, that the room was looking. Not all 200 people. I was at a far table. The sight lines were imperfect, but the section of the room around me, and the people at my table, and my mother, who was sitting 4 seats to my left with her hands wrapped around a wine glass. I said, "I'm here." Not loudly, but the table was close enough to a house microphone stand near the wall that it carried. Douglas said, "Come up. Just for a moment. I've been wanting to properly thank you in front of this room for 2 years." I stood. I set my napkin on the chair. I walked to the stage. What happened next took approximately 4 minutes. Douglas shook my hand with both of his, the way he always shook hands, both palms, a small contained warmth in it that was entirely his own. He turned to the microphone and he said, with the easy authority of a man who has been running a room for 25 years, that Petra Voss had delivered the keynote at this same event in 2022 and had spent 2 years before that working pro bono on a communication strategy that had materially changed the organization's relationship with its donor base. He said the December 2021 grant, worth $1.27 million, had been made possible in significant part by the proposal language she had written. He said he had been meaning to find a proper moment to say this publicly, and he was glad the room had given him one. Then he said, "Would you say a few words?" I had not prepared anything. I stood at the microphone for a brief moment, and I said what was true, that the work had been important to me, that RAC's mission was the kind of thing that made the work feel real, in a way not everything did, and that I was glad to be back in the room. 3 sentences. I meant all of them. Douglas asked if someone could get a photo. His communications coordinator appeared from the side of the stage with a camera. Douglas put his hand on my shoulder, and we stood together, and she took 3 frames. Then he shook my hand again, said thank you again, and I walked back to my table. The room applauded. Not the full room. It was a large space and the program was long. People's attention was distributed, but the section around the stage and the area nearest our table, which included my mother's company table in its entirety. I sat down. I picked up my water glass. I looked at nothing in particular. My mother was looking at me. She had the expression of someone who has been handed a document in a language she doesn't read. The auction segment ran from 9:34 p.m. until approximately 10:15 p.m. I participated in the bidding on a weekend pottery class that I won for $340, which I mention only because the paperwork required me to give my name, and I wrote it clearly on the form, and the event coordinator, a young woman named Jess, looked at the name and then at me and said, quietly, "Oh, you were the 2022 speaker. I watched the recording when I started here. It was really good." I thanked her. I meant it. My mother did not speak to me directly during the auction. She spoke to her friends. She bid on one item. She refilled her wine twice. I was aware of her peripheral attention, the slight angle of her body toward me that was not quite looking at me, but was tracking me in the way of someone recalibrating. At 10:22 p.m., Patrice asked me, directly, leaning across the table with the loosened friendliness of someone who has had 3 glasses of wine and decided that social caution is no longer necessary, what exactly I did for work. I told her. The consultancy, the specialization, the kind of organizations I worked with. I kept it to 4 sentences. She said, "So you're like, good at this." Not a slight. Just on a surprise. I said, "I think so, yes." She laughed. It was a different laugh from the one earlier in the lobby. This one was warm and slightly abashed, the laugh of someone who has realized they followed the wrong cue. My mother heard this exchange. I know because I watched her in my peripheral vision take a specific kind of sip from her wine glass, deliberate, contained, the sip of someone buying themselves a moment. The evening ended in the lobby at 10:47 p.m., the slow dispersal of coats and goodbyes, and the cold April air coming in from the street each time the doors opened. My mother's friends said their goodbyes to me with a warmth that had not been present at 7:18 p.m., Not dramatically different, not fawning, but adjusted. Carol, who had covered her mouth in the lobby, touched my arm briefly on the way out and said it had been lovely to meet me. I said the same. Douglas Harlan passed through the lobby at 10:51 p.m. He saw me and stopped. He said, "Are you in the city now? We should have coffee. There's a new initiative I'd love your perspective on." I said I was in the city, and yes, absolutely. We exchanged information for the second time. We had each other's contacts, but it had been long enough that a refresh made sense. He shook my hand again, said goodnight to my mother with a polite recognition of someone who has just learned who a person's parent is, and moved on. My mother and I walked her car in the parking structure at 11:03 p.m. She drove. We were on the street before she spoke. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" It was not a question, quite. The inflection was wrong for a question. It was flatter, more interior, as if she were asking herself rather than me. I said, "Tell you what?" She said, "Any of it. The speaking, the work, that you knew all these people." I looked at the road ahead of us. The city at 11 p.m., the specific quiet of late Friday streets, the traffic lights cycling through green and yellow and red for no one in particular. I said, "You didn't ask." She was quiet for a long time after that. Not the angry quiet, the other kind. The kind that means something is being processed in a place where processing takes time. She dropped me at my building at 11:19 p.m. I got out, thanked her for the ticket, told her I'd call on Tuesday. She nodded. She looked, in the light from the street lamp, briefly older than 57, not in a bad way, but in the way of someone who has just understood something they can't ununderstand. I closed the car door and watched her pull away, and then I stood on the pavement for a moment in the cold April air before going inside. In the 3 weeks since the gala, my mother has called me on 3 Tuesday evenings, which is our established frequency, and we have talked for our usual 20 minutes about the usual things. The gala has not come up directly, but something is different, in the small ways that things that are different show up in ordinary conversation. She asks follow-up questions now, where before she would move on. 2 weeks ago, she asked what project I was currently working on, and when I described it, a communications audit for a regional food bank system, she said, "And that's something you designed?" rather than filing it immediately under the category of things she doesn't fully understand and doesn't ask about. It is a small thing. I am not holding it as a transformation. I have been in this relationship long enough to understand that the changes that last are the ones that come slowly, through accumulation, and that the gala was a single data point in a long series, meaningful but not decisive. My mother is 57 years old and has been operating from the same set of assumptions for 20-something years, and those assumptions will not be revised in 3 weeks. But she asked a follow-up question. For now, that is enough. I have thought in the weeks since about what the evening actually was, what I want to take from it, and what I want to leave behind. I don't think it was about the moment at the microphone, exactly, or even about Douglas's remarks, generous as they were. I think it was about something quieter and older, about the green dress in the closet, and the 2 years it had been hanging there, and the fact that I had worn it back into the same room without needing anyone to know why. We carry versions of ourselves in storage, the way we carry anything we're not ready to put down or give away. The version of me who stood at that podium in March of 2022 had been in a closet at my mother's house for a long time, not because I had hidden her, but because no one had opened the door to look. I had learned, slowly and at some cost, that I did not need the door opened by someone else. I could open it myself. I could wear the dress and walk into the room and let the room be what it was going to be. What the evening offered me was not vindication. Exactly. That word requires the wound to still be open, and I had been working on mine for a long time. What it offered was something closer to alignment. The person I had been building, quietly, over 12 years of professional work and 2 years of the specific labor of building a life on my own terms, was briefly visible in the same room as the version of me my mother had been carrying. And for 4 minutes, in front of 200 people, the two versions occupied the same space, and there was no room for the older one to insist on itself. You cannot force someone to update the story they carry about you. You can only live the actual story as clearly and as fully as you can until the gap between the two becomes difficult to ignore. What happens after that is theirs to manage. Your part is just to keep showing up in the dress. Research on family communication patterns consistently finds that adult children who build lives substantially different from parental expectations are frequently perceived by parents as having failed, not because the life is a failure, but because it doesn't match the map the parent drew. If you find yourself in a family where your actual accomplishments are invisible because they don't fit the category you've been placed in, know this: the category belongs to the person who made it. You are not required to shrink to fit it. You are not required to announce yourself, either. You can simply show up, fully, and let the room do the work. If you were in Petra's position, if you had walked back into that ballroom in the same dress you wore to give the keynote 2 years earlier, and your mother had introduced you as nobody special, would you have told her what you knew before the evening began? Or would you have let it unfold the way Petra did, without a word?